In 7 days, this city will become a black spot on the map. The fishmonger outside the window will fall silent forever. 300 million people will die within a year, and only one person on the entire continent knows where to hide. Right now, he's finishing his barley soup at a harbor tavern and licking the spoon clean. His name is Caden. He opens his eyes and doesn't scream. That's the hardest part. He recognizes the low wooden ceiling. He recognizes the damp spot in the corner. He looked at it 7 days ago, or in 7 days. He clenches his fingers into a fist. All 10 are there, not burned, not crushed by a rock. He runs his tongue over his teeth. They're all intact. Last time, half of them were gone, because last time, Caden died. For 8 years, he served as the court prophet at the Duke's court. For 8 years, he made accurate predictions. The ambassador's death, a crop failure, the guard captain's betrayal. They listened to him as long as his prophecies were convenient. And then he began to speak of the end of the world. At first, they laughed at him. Then they stopped summoning him. And last week, he was arrested for spreading panic. He was flogged in the town square, thrown into the Citadel's dungeon to die of thirst, and when the air above the city hummed with an unfamiliar sound, he realized he had been right. The Citadel collapsed in on itself. Caden died staring into the darkness. But death turned out not to be the end. For 2 months he hung there as a ghost, bound to his own corpse. He saw everything. He saw cities burning. He saw people fleeing. He saw the wise hiding golden cellars that would become graves within an hour. And he saw the refuge, an entrance in the rock, seals, SSS-rank, the only place on the continent where the other side hadn't reached. He memorized it. And then he woke up, alive, 7 days before the catastrophe, knowing everything that would happen down to the hour. In 7 days, the veins of the world would burst, all 17 nodes, simultaneously. The other side would pour out of the fissures, not an army, not monsters, the very antimatter of reality. The capital will fall overnight. The imperial family will be torn apart by their own guards. And this is where the strangest part begins. Caden has no intention of saving anyone. He walks over to the window and looks down. Carts, sailors, a woman dragging a basket of apples. A boy is herding a goat between the market stalls. They're all dead. They just don't know it yet. Caden turns away. He's already tried to save people. He was flogged for it and left for dead. This time, he has a plan. Not some vague, we need to do something kind of plan. A concrete one, down to the hour. 6 people he'll take with him. Resources he'll intercept before they go up in flames. A route to the shelter through lands that will still be passable. But knowledge comes at a price. Every intervention he makes changes the future. The more people he intercepts, the faster the map in his head will become obsolete. By the 7th day, it will only work for major events. That's why every step must pay off many times over. First, money. More precisely, a commodity that in 4 days will be worth more than gold. Salt. The entire southern harvest will be shipped to his Nanka on the 5th day. Caden goes down to the hall and heads out to the market. He isn't looking for goods. He's looking for a face. And he finds her at a stall selling dried roots. A woman of about 25, dark hair tied in a bun. Her hands are buried in the dirt up to her elbows. Aideen Song, an herbalist. In her past life, she healed hundreds of people in refugee camps. She worked without sleep or food. She died of exhaustion 4 months later. She lay down on the ground and never got up. No one noticed. Caden asks her for black mint root. She replies that black mint doesn't grow in the north. He insists. She looks at him longer than she would a typical customer. She says she knows of one place in the foothills, a 5-day journey. He says he'll head there in 2 days and needs someone who knows about herbs. He offers a good price. She promises to think it over. Caden nods. He knows she'll agree. In her past life, she went south alone, with no plan and no chance of survival. This time, she'll go with him. By evening, he returns to the tavern. At a table in the back, 7 merchants are arguing about the drop in salt prices. The loudest of them all is a fat man with a red beard and a gold chain, Martin Cross. Caden sits down across from him and places 5 copper coins on the table. Small change. He proposes a bet. In 2 hours, a man in a green cloak will walk into the tavern. He'll order mulled wine, and he'll drop a silver ring on the floor. If that happens, Martin will sell him the salt warehouse for half price. If not, the copper coins go to Martin. The merchants roar with laughter. Martin snorts and accepts. Caden leans back in his chair. He kelts some water. He counts his heartbeats. Just like back then in the dungeon before he died. 2 hours and 12 minutes pass. The door opens. A man in a green cloak enters. He approaches the bar. He orders mulled wine. He drops a glove. He bends down, and a silver ring slips off his finger. It rolls across the floor with a faint tinkling sound. It comes to rest at the leg of Martin's chair. The silence lasts 4 seconds. Martin's face turns pale. He picks up the ring with a trembling hand. He looks at Caden. Caden isn't smiling. He sits down across from him. Martin whispers, "How did you know?" Caden replies that it doesn't matter. What matters is that the salt warehouse had better change hands today. Martin signs the paper with a trembling hand. The ink smudges on the last letter. Caden takes the document and steps out into the night. The air is cold. It smells of the sea. The stars shine brightly and seem close. In 6 days, they'll be hidden behind a black veil. Caden presses his fingers against the wooden wall of the tavern, and he feels it, barely perceptible, like a draft, but not from a crack, from the very stone beneath his feet. The veins of the world are already trembling, like a taut string a moment before it snaps. 6 days until that moment. He has the salt. The herbalist has been found. Ahead lie 5 people he must rescue before the world ends. The morning of the second day began with rain. Caden stood by the window and counted the raindrops on the glass. In his past life, this rain had lasted until noon. Then the sun would come out. Then, on the southern road from Homeguard, a caravan carrying medical supplies would appear. 12 wagons escorted by mercenaries. The caravan was headed for the capital. It would never make it there. 4 hours after leaving Homeguard, the caravan will be attacked by bandits at the Red Ravine Pass. The guards will scatter. The wagons will be burned. Bandages, ointments, tinctures, and surgical instruments will turn to ash. 1 female mercenary will stay behind to fight. She'll kill 4 of them. She'll take a blow to the side. She'll crawl to the stream. She'll survive. Her name is Minjun Park, 28 years old, from the southern lands, sharp-tongued, straightforward, with a very loud laugh that Caden heard exactly twice in his entire past life, and with her sister, her younger sister, 16 years old, who in her past life died in the first hours of the fall in the village of Millwood. Minjung blamed herself until the very end. Caden stepped away from the window. He had 3 hours before the caravan appeared on the southern road, and one more thing he needed to do first. He went downstairs. The tavern owner was wiping down the bar. Caden asked if there was anyone at the port who handled urgent passenger transport. The owner gave him a name. Caden stepped out into the rain. Homeguard Harbor was half empty in the early morning hours. The fishermen hadn't returned yet. Merchant ships were anchored in the roadstead. Caden found the man he was looking for at the 3rd pier. The ferryman was a thin, one-eyed old man with a boat that had seen better days. Caden paid him in silver up front. The mission was simple. Get to the village of Millwood, find a girl named Una Park, 16 years old, black hair, a burn scar on her left wrist. Tell her that her sister is waiting for her in Homeguard. Bring her here, today, before sunset. The ferryman asked what would happen if the girl didn't want to go. Caden added another silver coin and said she would want to. Una Park loved her sister more than anything in the world. She would go. The old man took the money and set off. Caden watched as the boat disappeared into the gray mist of the rain. In her past life, Una Park died 5 days later. In this life, she'll be in Homeguard by evening. And tomorrow, Minjun will find her alive. And he won't understand anything. And he'll be afraid to understand. Caden returned to the city. The rain began to let up. He went to the market. Erin Song was standing at her usual spot. The roots were laid out on a dry cloth under the awning. She looked at Caden and said she agreed. But she had conditions. She wanted to know exactly where they were going, and why. Caden said they were going to the Grey Mountains, in search of rare herbs and minerals. The trip would take about a week, maybe longer. He'd pay 10 silver coins a day. That was 4 times what she earned at the market in a week. Irene said it wasn't about the money. She asked why he'd chosen her specifically. There were other herbalists at the market. Caden replied that he'd seen how she cut the roots, smoothly, neatly, without a single unnecessary movement. Someone like that wouldn't panic if something went wrong. That was true, but not the whole truth. Irene nodded. She said she'd be ready by tomorrow morning. Caden thanked her and left. By noon, the rain had stopped. The sun emerged from behind the clouds. Just like in his past life, Caden stood at the southern gate of Homeguard and waited. The road led out of the city along the coast and then turned inland through the hills. The caravan appeared 20 minutes later. 12 wagons covered with gray cloth, 4 mounted guards in front, 3 behind, and one figure was walking alongside the 3rd wagon, tall, broad-shouldered, with a short sword at his belt and a shield on his back. Minjun Park. Caden stepped out onto the road and raised his hand. The caravan stopped. The senior guard shouted at him to get out of the way. Caden ignored him. He approached the man sitting on the first wagon, the caravan leader, a middle-aged merchant with a weary face. Caden introduced himself and said he wanted to buy the entire caravan, all 12 wagons with their cargo, right then and there, at full market price plus 20% on top. The caravan leader looked at him as if he were crazy. He asked why he would buy an entire caravan of medical supplies in an empty port when they'd fetch 3 times as much in the capital. Caden said the caravan wouldn't make it to the capital. The caravan master frowned. He asked what he meant. Caden pulled a leather pouch from his bag. He untied it. Gold glinted inside. 30 gold coins, a small fortune for a mid-level merchant. He said that in 3 hours, at the Red Ravine Pass, the caravan would be attacked. The guards would scatter, the cargo would be burned. They could verify his words and lose everything. Or they could take the gold, turn the wagons around, and head home alive. The caravan leader remained silent. Minjung Park stepped closer. She had heard everything. Caden looked at her. Dark eyes, a stern gaze, a scar on his cheekbone from an old fight. His hands on the hilt of his sword. Not threatening, just a habit. She asked how he knew about the ambush. Caden replied that he had his sources. She said that wasn't an answer. He agreed, saying that she wouldn't like the real answer, but he offered her something else, a job, a well-paid one, for a week, maybe longer, to guard a small group on a trek through the Gray Mountains. Minjun stared at him without blinking. Then she asked how much. Caden named the sum. It was ridiculously high. Minjung snorted and said that for that kind of money, she'd guard even a blind goat on a trek through all 7 circles of hell. The caravan leader took the gold. He turned the wagons around. Caden hired 2 dock workers and transported the medical supplies to a rented warehouse next to the salt warehouse. Bandages, burn ointments, tinctures for fever, surgical knives, suture thread, pain-relieving powders. All of this would be worth more than gold in a week, because you can't put gold on a wound. Minjun helped carry the boxes. She worked in silence, quickly, without asking unnecessary questions. When the last box was in place, she sat down on it and looked at Caden. She asked when she could leave. He said the morning after tomorrow. He still had business to attend to in town. She nodded and asked where she should spend the night. He gave her the key to a room at the Grey Goose, the one next to his. She took the key and left. Caden remained alone in the warehouse. He locked the doors. He leaned his back against the wall. He pressed his palms against the stone floor. And he felt it again. A tremor. Fainter than yesterday, but more distinct, as if the earth beneath the city had begun to hum at a frequency inaudible to the ear, but felt by the bones. The world's veins were straining. The nearest node was 100 miles to the south. It would burst as the 4th, on the 5th day. By then, they should already be in the mountains. Caden took his hands off the floor and stepped outside. The sun was setting. The harbor glowed orange. Beautiful. He thought this might be one of the last sunsets the city would ever see. Then he shook the thought from his mind. You can't think about beauty. You can't think about 300 million. You can think about the 6 of them, about a room with a window for Aiden, about a smithy for Diana, about tea for Soyeon. That's the only way to move forward. He returned to the tavern. Minjung was sitting in the common room, eating fried fish. She was eating greedily and quickly. Caden sat down across from her. She asked what kind of expedition it was. He said he'd explain in more detail once the whole group was assembled. She asked how many people there were. He replied that there would be 8, including him. She raised an eyebrow and asked, 8 people and 1 mercenary for protection? He nodded. She said, either the expedition is safe and she isn't needed, or it was dangerous and she alone wasn't enough. Caden replied that the expedition would be strange, and that she alone was worth 10 men. Minjung looked at him. She didn't smile, but Caden saw the corners of her lips twitch slightly. She finished her fish and went upstairs. Caden sat there a little longer. The tavern door opened. A one-eyed ferryman walked in. Behind him stood a girl. Thin, black hair, frightened eyes, a burn scar on her left wrist. Yuna Park. The ferryman said the girl had come along without asking any questions. She'd heard her sister's name and jumped into the boat. Caden thanked the old man and called over the innkeeper. He paid for another room. He took Yuna upstairs. She asked where Minjung was. He told her that her sister was sleeping in the next room. They'd see each other in the morning. Yuna nodded. Her hands were shaking. Caden brought her dinner from the kitchen and left her alone. He stepped out into the hallway. He leaned against the wall. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow morning, Minjung would open the door to the next room and see her younger sister alive and unharmed. She wouldn't know how it had happened. She wouldn't know that Caden had sent a boat for Yuna before they met. She'll simply see her sister, and for a second, the world will stand still for her. And then she'll look at Caden, and in her eyes will be a question he won't be able to answer. Not yet, anyway. Caden went to his room. He lay down on the bed. He pressed his fingers against the wall. A tremor, slightly stronger than this morning. 6 days. He closed his eyes, and once again, he couldn't sleep. Caden sent a boat to fetch his sister Minjung from the village of Millwood before Minjung even knew he existed. He intercepted a caravan carrying medical supplies, paying with gold, and hired Minjung Park to guard the group. Areen Song agreed to join the expedition. Yuna Park was brought to home guard and is waiting to meet with her sister. A scream woke Caden at dawn on the 3rd day. Not a scream of terror, a scream of recognition, high-pitched and clear. Yuna. He lay there with his eyes open, listening. A door slammed behind the wall, quick footsteps, a dull thud of bodies. Then silence. A long silence. Then Minjung's voice, low, hoarse, broken. Caden didn't move. This wasn't his moment. It was their moment, the sisters who were never meant to meet again. He gave them 20 minutes. Then he got up, got dressed, went downstairs. He ordered 3 breakfasts. When Minjung appeared in the dining room, her eyes were red. Yuna was holding her hand and wouldn't let go. Minjung looked at Caden for a long time. He held her gaze. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Then she simply sat down at the table. She picked up a spoon. She started eating. Yuna sat down next to her and pressed herself against her shoulder. Caden ate in silence. Minjung didn't ask a single question, but Caden could see how she looked at him when she thought he wasn't noticing, with fear. Not of him, of what he might be. After breakfast, Caden said that Yuna would be going with them. For the first time that morning, Minjung spoke. She asked where exactly. He said to a safe place. She said there were no such things as safe places. He replied that there was one. She didn't argue. She didn't have the strength to argue. Her sister was right there, alive, warm. For Minjung, nothing else existed at that moment. Caden left the sisters at the tavern and headed into town. The 3rd day, the busiest one. 3 tasks and each one couldn't wait. First, the blacksmith. Caden left home guard through the western gate and walked along the country road. An hour's walk brought him to the village of Brannan. Small, 20 houses, a blacksmith shop on the outskirts, smoke rising from the chimney, the clang of a hammer. Hollis Tate, 52 years old, hands like shovels, a mottled beard, an old-school blacksmith. He makes horseshoes, axes, gate hinges, the kind of heavy, rough work that anyone can do and that pays very little. Next to the smithy stood a second forge, small, neat. A young woman was sitting behind it, 19 years old, dark hair, an apron with scorched holes. In her hands were a pair of thin tongs. She held a tiny part and turned it in the flame with the precision of a watchmaker. Diana Tate. Caden stopped. He remembered Diana. He remembered her hands. In a past life, those hands had made jewelry and mechanisms that no one bought. Because a serious blacksmith makes weapons, not toys. That's what his father used to say. Hollis wasn't a cruel man. He just didn't understand. Diana noticed Caden and looked up. She asked what he needed. A horseshoe? A knife? A noose? He said he needed a blacksmith shop. The whole thing, with everything in it. And the blacksmith. And his daughter. Diana frowned. She called out to her father. Hollis came out of the forge, wiping his hands on his apron. Caden introduced himself and said he wanted to buy the forge, all the equipment, all the metal supplies, all the tools, and to hire Hollis and his daughter to work there, long-term, with relocation. Hollis asked how much. Caden named a price twice the market rate. Hollis was silent for 10 seconds. Then he asked why. Caden said he was building a workshop in the mountains. He needed an experienced blacksmith and a master of fine work. Hollis looked at his daughter. Diana crossed her arms over her chest. She said she was the one who did the fine work here. Caden nodded and said that was exactly why he was there. He needed locks, gears, springs, mechanisms that don't yet exist, and a man who knows how to think with his hands. Diana looked at him differently, without suspicion, but with interest. For the first time, someone had come for her work rather than her father's axe. Hollis scratched his beard. He asked when they should leave. Caden said tomorrow, at dawn. Hollis asked where exactly. Caden replied that they were going to the Gray Mountains. Hollis said that normal people don't go through the Gray Mountains. Caden replied that he wasn't normal. Hollis glanced at the gold that Caden had laid out on the anvil, then at his daughter. Diana shrugged and said she didn't care where, as long as there was a smithy. Hollis sighed and said he'd be ready by evening. Caden left a deposit and left. The second matter, the salt warehouse. Caden returned to Home Guard around noon and headed for the commercial district. He found the man he was looking for, a mid-level merchant named Alden Vick. In his past life, Alden had been one of the few merchants who'd had the foresight to stockpile food before the collapse. Not because he knew the future, he was simply cautious and greedy by nature. That saved his life. His supplies fed an entire refugee camp for 3 weeks. But Alden didn't give anything away for free. He sold food at prices that made people cry, and yet they bought it anyway, because the alternative was death. Caden approached Alden and proposed a deal, the entire salt stockpile in exchange for a favor. Alden asked what kind of favor. Caden said that in 3 days he would need a supply train, 4 wagons, horses, and a guide through the northern passes of the Gray Mountains. Alden said it was madness. The northern passes were closed by snow until summer. Caden replied that one pass was open. He knew which one, and he knew the way. Alden asked how he knew. Caden didn't answer. He simply opened the document for the salt warehouse in front of him and waited. Alden could do the math. The salt warehouse was worth 3 times as much as a wagon train with horses. A minute later, he agreed. The third job was the most dangerous. Caden was walking along the harbor promenade when he felt a gaze. Not the usual glance of a passerby. It was heavy, intent, like an arrowhead pressed against the back of his neck. He didn't stop. He didn't turn around. He kept walking at the same pace. But inside, everything tightened. The third day. Sooner than he'd expected. In his past life, attention hadn't been drawn to him until the 4th day. He'd changed too much. He'd bought things too quickly. The map of the future was already beginning to blur at the edges. Caden turned into an alley. Dark, narrow, between 2 warehouses. The smell of rotten fish and wet stone. He walked to the middle and stopped. He heard footsteps behind him. Slow, steady. Caden turned around. A man was standing in the alleyway. Of average height, thin, a gray cloak, gray hair, though his face was young. His eyes were light, almost white, like cataracts. But he could see. He could see better than anyone else. Gray. Caden knew that name. In his past life, Gray had appeared later, on the 5th day, when the Duke's secret police were already hunting Caden. Gray had killed 2 of the Duke's agents, not because he was protecting Caden, but because they were in the way. Then he had come for Caden himself. But he hadn't made it in time. The world had collapsed earlier. Now he stood in the alleyway, staring at Caden with his white eyes. Caden stood motionless. Gray didn't move. 10 steps separated them. Caden said he knew who he was. Gray tilted his head slightly, like a bird. He said it was interesting because they had never met. Caden replied that they had met, just not this time. Gray froze. His white eyes widened slightly. Then he took a step back, turned around, and walked away, without a word. Caden stood in the alley for another minute. His heart was beating steadily. His hands weren't shaking, but he knew this wasn't the end. Gray had left because he'd heard something he hadn't expected. He would think it over, check it out, and come back. Caden walked out of the alley and headed back to the tavern. Halfway there, he pressed his hand against the wall of the nearest house. The tremor grew stronger. Before, it could have been mistaken for the wind. Now it was distinct, constant, like the pulse of a sick city. 5 days. Irene was waiting for him at the tavern. She was sitting in the dining room with 2 bags of belongings at her feet. She asked when they were leaving. Caden said the day after tomorrow, at dawn. She nodded. She asked who else was coming. He listed them off. A mercenary, a blacksmith and his daughter, the mercenary's sister, possibly 1 or 2 more. Irene asked if this was a military campaign or an expedition. He replied that it was neither. She looked at him with her gray-green eyes. She said he was a strange man. He agreed. That evening, Caden sat in his room laying out maps. Tomorrow would be the 4th day. He would pick up the supply wagon from Alden, load the supplies, and the group would leave Home Guard. But tomorrow there would be something else. Agents of the 7th Temple. In his past life, they had appeared on the 4th day. 2 inquisitors in white robes. They walked through Home Guard, searching for the source of what they called unauthorized prophetic radiation. Caden hadn't understood that term in his past life. Now he did. It simply existed. And for the temple's oracles, it was like a beacon in the darkness. A person who knows the future glows for those who know how to look. They need to leave Home Guard before they find him. Caden folded the maps, put them in his bag, checked the list in his head. Salt had been traded for a wagon, medical supplies were in the warehouse, Aideen was ready, Minjung and Yuna were here, Hollis and Diana would be ready by morning. 2 remained. Heira Jung, a novice at the Temple of the Moon in the Whitewater Monastery. The monastery would go up in flames on the 5th day. Caden remembered the exact hour. And So-yeon Han, the court archivist. She'd be on the road from the capital on the 6th day. He'd intercept her on her way to the hideout. Everything was going according to plan, except for Gray, and the Inquisitors, and the fact that his map of the future was losing clarity with every passing hour. Caden lay down on the bed. He pressed his fingers against the wall. A tremor. He no longer needed to listen closely. It was like a second heartbeat. The world was dying, slowly, carefully, like a person who doesn't yet know they're sick. 5 days. Minjung met with Sister Yuna and didn't ask Caden any questions, though her fear of what he knew was beginning to grow. Caden bought Hollis Tate's blacksmith shop along with his daughter Diana. He traded salt for a wagon from Alden Vic. He encountered the Grey One for the first time in an alley home guard and spoke words that made the assassin leave. The 4th day began with a move. Caden roused everyone before dawn. The Grey Goose Tavern was still asleep when the group came downstairs with their belongings. Aaron was carrying 2 sacks of herbs and tools. Minjung was leading Yuna by the hand. A sword in its sheath hung over her shoulder. Caden paid the innkeeper. He gave him a generous tip. The innkeeper asked if they were leaving for good. Caden replied that they were. The innkeeper wished them a safe journey. Caden looked at him. He memorized his face. In 3 days, this man would be running along the burning embankment. He wouldn't make it. Caden turned away and walked out. At the western gate, Olden Vic was waiting for them with a wagon train. 4 wagons, 6 horses. The guide was sitting on the first wagon, a silent man with a square face. Caden checked the cargo. The salt had been repacked into waterproof bags. Medical supplies were distributed among 2 wagons. The 3rd wagon was loaded with provisions. The 4th was still half empty, for Hollis's tools. They pulled into Brannan half an hour later. Hollis was standing by the blacksmith shop with bundles tied up. Diana was beside him. Her face wore an expression that Caden would describe as fierce anticipation. She was loading her little horn onto the wagon with the same tenderness a mother uses to tuck a child in. Hollis approached Caden. He said he'd said goodbye to the neighbors. They think he's gone mad. Caden replied that he hadn't. He was simply going where he was needed. Hollis grunted and climbed onto the wagon. The convoy set off along the western road, away from the coast, toward the hills, and then on to the Gray Mountains. Caden walked alongside the lead wagon, keeping track of the time. By noon, they should pass the fork at the old bridge. By evening, they'd reach the foothills. Tomorrow, the ascent would begin. Time was running short. The first 2 hours of the journey passed smoothly. The road was empty. A few peasants in the fields, a shepherd with his flock on a hill, a peaceful landscape. A normal day in the Velgard Empire. None of these people knew that in 3 days, the fields would be gone, and the hill would be gone, and the shepherd. Caden looked at them and felt nothing. He had forgotten how to feel that way in his past life. Months spent as a ghost among the ruins had killed his compassion. Only arithmetic remained. 6. Yuna was the 7th. The supply train, the route, the refuge. Minjun caught up with him and walked beside him. She was silent for a few minutes. Then she spoke. She said she'd sent her sister to him while she was still awake. Yuna explained that a one-eyed old man had rowed up to her in a boat and told her that her sister was waiting. Minjung asked when Caden had sent that boat. Caden replied that it was on the morning of the 2nd day. Minjung stopped. Caden kept walking. She caught up with him after 3 steps. She said that on the morning of the 2nd day, they hadn't met yet. He had sent the boat for Yuna before he even met Minjung. Caden nodded. Minjung fell silent. She walked beside him. Caden could sense her mind racing. He could tell she was trying to find an explanation that wouldn't be frightening. She couldn't find one. She asked who he was. He replied that he was simply a man who knew more than he should. She said that wasn't an answer. He agreed. She fell silent again. But she didn't walk away. She kept walking beside him. That was more important than any answer. The fork in the road at the old bridge appeared around noon, a stone bridge across the Vern River, narrow, old, built even before the Empire. Caden stopped the caravan. Not to rest. He was waiting. Minjun asked why they were standing there. Caden said he'd see soon enough. 10 minutes later, 2 figures appeared on the road from the east. White robes, hoods thrown back, young faces, too smooth, too calm. Around each of their necks was a medallion in the shape of a 7-pointed star. Inquisitors of the 7th Temple. They were heading toward Holmgard. So they hadn't arrived yet. So they hadn't started searching yet. Caden ordered everyone to sit quietly and not draw attention to themselves. The caravan stood by the roadside like an ordinary trading party taking a break. The Inquisitors walked past. One of them slowed his pace slightly. He turned his head. He looked at Caden. Caden felt a chill run down his spine. Not a physical one, a magical one. A scan. The Inquisitor was trying to probe him. Caden relaxed his body. He steadied his breathing. He thought about the soup, about the creak of the wagon, about the smell of the road. Nothing related to the future. The Inquisitor turned away. He walked on. Caden waited until they disappeared around the bend. Then he gave the order to move, quickly. The wagon train surged across the bridge. The wheels clattered on the stone. The horses snorted. When the bridge was behind them, Caden exhaled. Irene approached him. She asked quietly who it was. He replied that they were people looking for him. She asked what for. He said it was because he knew things that, in their opinion, only their oracles were allowed to know. Irene was silent for a moment. Then she said that in that case, they'd better hurry. Caden almost smiled. By evening, the caravan had reached the foothills of the Gray Mountains. The road began to climb. The trees grew taller and denser. The air turned colder. Caden chose a place to spend the night, a clearing by a stream, enclosed on 3 sides by cliffs. In his past life, he had passed through this spot. Back then, it had been empty. Now a camp stood there. His camp. They unloaded some of their supplies. Hollis built a fire. Diana helped her father. She moved quickly and precisely, not a single unnecessary gesture. Yuna sat next to Minjung and held her hand tightly. Aideen laid out the herbs by the fire. She dried the roots. She sorted through the leaves, calmly and methodically, as if they were on a routine rest stop rather than fleeing the end of the world. Caden sat a little to the side. He watched them. 6 out of 8. 2 left. Heira Jung. Tomorrow. The Whitewater Monastery. Soyeon Han. The 6th day. The road from the capital. He'll make it. He has to make it. Minjung sat down next to him. She handed him a piece of bread with cheese. He took it. She asked why he wasn't eating with everyone else. He replied that he was used to being alone. She said that habits can be changed. He looked at her. In the light of the campfire, her face looked warm. The scar on her cheekbone looked like a shadow. She wasn't smiling. But she wasn't frowning either. She was just looking at him, as if he were a problem she hadn't solved yet, but was sure to solve. Caden took a bite of the bread. Suddenly, Minjung jumped to her feet, her hand on her sword. Caden stood up too. A figure emerged from the darkness behind the trees. A gray cloak, white eyes. The gray one stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at them. Minjung stepped forward and stood between him and the camp. Caden placed his hand on her shoulder. He said quietly that there was no need. The gray one hadn't come to fight. Minjung didn't lower her hand from her sword. Caden stepped around her and took 3 steps toward the gray one. The gray one spoke. His voice was quiet and steady, like the rustle of paper. He said he'd checked, that he'd looked for anyone who might know Caden Orwell. No one did. This man hadn't existed in Homeguard a week ago. No records, no witnesses. He'd just appeared, with money, with a plan, with information that was impossible to obtain. Gray asked from which fall Caden had returned. Caden was silent for 3 seconds. Then he answered, "From this one." Gray tilted his head slightly. He asked how many he'd saved that time. Caden replied, "None." Gray looked at him for a long time. Then he said that they were the same, only he was older. He turned and stepped into the darkness. He vanished among the trees without a sound. Minjung approached Caden. She asked what that was about. He replied that it was a man who once had failed to save anyone and now believed that prophets did not deserve to survive. Minjung asked if Caden thought otherwise. He didn't answer. That night he lay awake, listening to the tremor. It was traveling through the earth, through the rocks, through the tree roots. 4 days. The world's veins pulsed like blood vessels about to burst. Soon the whole world would hear what only he had heard, but by then it would be too late. The group left Homeguard and set out for the Gray Mountains. Minjung learned that Caden had sent a boat to fetch Yuna before they had met, and she began to suspect something impossible. At a fork in the trail, they passed by the Inquisitors of the 7th Temple. Gray found the camp that night and asked Caden which fall he had returned from. Caden answered, and Seri left, calling them both the same. Day 5. The caravan made its way up a narrow mountain trail. The trees grew sparser. The air grew thinner and colder. The Gray Mountains had earned their name. The rock here was gray. The sky was gray. Even the snow on the peaks looked gray beneath the low-hanging clouds. Caden walked ahead of the caravan, counting his steps. Not out of nervousness, he was measuring the distance. It was a 2-hour walk to the Whitewater Monastery if they turned onto the eastern trail at the crevice. The monastery would light up at noon. They had time, but it was cutting it close. He turned to the group and said he needed to step away, for a few hours. Minjun asked where. He replied that he was going after someone. She asked who. He said he was going after a girl in a burning monastery. Minjun looked at him. She asked, "Burning?" He replied that the monastery would catch fire by noon. Minjung looked up at the sky. It was early morning. Then she looked at Caden. She wasn't even surprised anymore. She just nodded. She said she'd go with him. Caden shook his head. He said they couldn't leave the caravan unguarded. They were in the mountains. The trail was narrow. If anyone attacked, Minjung was the only one who could protect the others. Minjung clenched her jaw. She said she didn't like letting him go alone. He replied that he didn't like it either, but there was no choice. Caden left the caravan in a clearing by the crevice and set off along the eastern trail, alone, quickly. The trail led through a rocky scree slope, then through a pine forest, and came out at a cliff. Down in the valley, the Whitewater Monastery glowed white. Stone walls, a tiled roof, a small courtyard with a well, the Temple of the Moon, one of hundreds of monasteries scattered throughout the empire. Novices lived here, 30 women, prayers, meditation, working with magical currents. Caden looked at the sun. In an hour, maybe less. He descended the scree slope and approached the monastery wall. The gate was open. Morning cleaning was underway in the courtyard. 2 novices were carrying water. One was sweeping the steps. Caden entered. The senior novice at the gate stopped him. She asked what he wanted. Men were forbidden to enter the monastery without the abbess's permission. Caden said he needed Hira Jong. He said it was urgent. The senior novice frowned. She went inside. Caden waited at the gate. He looked at the walls. The stone was old, dry, imbued with the magic of the world vein, like all temple structures. That was exactly what would kill him. When the nearest world vein burst, the magic would surge back through the stone. The walls would become red hot. They'll burst into flames. Not with fire, something worse. A white heat that melts stone. 5 minutes later, a girl came out. Small, fragile, black hair down to her shoulders, large, dark eyes. 22 years old, but she looked younger. Ha-Ra Jung. She looked at Caden with quiet curiosity, without fear. He remembered that look. In his past life, he'd met her a month after the fall. She'd survived back then only because she'd been in the woods when the monastery went up in flames. She'd been picking mushrooms, a coincidence that saved her life. This time, there would be no coincidence. This time, he would get her out before the fire. Hera asked who he was. Caden said he needed her to leave this place, right now. She asked why. He said the monastery was in danger. She looked at the walls, then at the sky, then at her hands. She raised her palms and spread her fingers. She held them like that for a few seconds. Then she lowered them. She said the walls were singing. She'd been feeling it for 3 days now. The walls used to be silent. Now they're singing. Very softly, very high-pitched. Caden nodded. She felt the same thing he did. Tension in the magical fabric. Only she heard it as a sound, while he felt it as a tremor. 2 different gifts, 1 meaning. He said the singing would turn into a scream, and when that happened, everyone inside the walls would burn. Hera looked at him calmly, too calmly for someone who'd just been told that his home would turn into a furnace. She asked about the others, 30 novices, the Mother Superior. Caden was silent. She understood from his silence. She asked if that meant he'd come only for her. He nodded. She asked why her. He replied that she could hear Iznanka before she arrived. It was a gift that no one else possessed anymore. She asked if the gifts of the other novices meant nothing. He replied that it did, but he couldn't save everyone. She stood in silence. She looked out at the courtyard, at the well, at the broom leaning against the wall, at the pine tree by the gate. Then she said she would go. But she needed to take one thing. She went inside for 3 minutes. She returned with a small wooden lantern in her hand, old and worn, with a pattern of moons carved on the sides. Caden recognized it. In her past life, Hera had told him about this lantern. It was from her home village, the only thing left from her life before the monastery. She pressed it to her chest and looked at the gate. Caden said they had to go. She nodded. She didn't look back. They walked along the path in silence. Hera was small and walked slowly. Caden didn't rush her. There was still time. An hour later, she spoke. She asked what he wanted from her. Caden replied that he wanted her to be safe. She said that no one had ever wanted her to be safe. At the monastery, they wanted her to listen. That was different. Caden stopped. He looked at her. He asked what she liked to eat. Hera stopped too. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She hesitated. She said she didn't know. They fed her whatever they gave her. She never chose. Caden nodded. He said they'd figure it out. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't name. Not gratitude, not distrust, something before that. Like the first breath before you start breathing. By midday, they reached the clearing where the caravan was camped. Minjung saw Hera and looked at Caden. She asked, "Is that the girl from the burning monastery?" Caden said the monastery wasn't burning yet. Minjung looked east. 2 hours later, a white glow flared up on the horizon, silent, bright as a second sun. Everyone turned. Hera stood and watched. The white light reflected in her eyes. She wasn't crying. She didn't cry out. She just pressed the flashlight a little tighter to her chest. Minjung slowly turned to Caden. There was something new on her face. Not fear, not suspicion, realization. She saw the glow. She saw that Caden had taken Hera away 2 hours before the disaster. She saw that he knew, for sure, down to the hour. Just like with the boat for Yuna, just like with the ring in the tavern, just like with the caravan. She didn't say a word. She turned away. She walked over to the wagon. She began checking the fastenings. Aideen approached Hera. She quietly asked if she was hurt. Hera shook her head. Aideen took a blanket out of her bag and draped it over her shoulders. Hera looked at her in surprise, as if no one had ever given her a blanket before. Diana walked over. She looked at the glow that was already fading. She said it wasn't a fire. A fire is orange. This was white, like molten metal. Hollis nodded. He said he'd seen something like this once before, when a magical horn had exploded at a fair in the capital. Only back then, it had been a small horn. This, however, was an entire monastery. Caden ordered them to move on. The caravan set off. The trail climbed higher. The air grew even colder. Caden pressed his fingers against a rock by the side of the trail. The trembling was no longer just a background sensation. It was a rhythm, constant, intensifying, like a drum behind a wall beating faster and faster. The third vein of the world had just burst, the one that sustained the monastery. Sooner than in his past life, a few hours earlier, acceleration. The map of the future was blurring. The finer details were already fading. He remembered the route. He remembered where the refuge was. He remembered who and when. But the details of the day, the exact times, the specific faces of the people they'd meet, all of that was beginning to waver and shift. There was no time to delay. Caden walked ahead of the caravan, mentally replaying the next 2 days. The 6th day, the road out of the capital, Soyan Khan. He knew she was leaving the capital the day before the collapse. In his past life, she had died on the 3rd day after the catastrophe. She froze to death in a ditch by the road, alone, with a bag full of books. She'd carried the books until the very end. Not food, not water, books. Because that was the only thing she was valued for, and the only thing she knew how to do. In this life, Caden would intercept her on the mountain road, if he made it in time. That evening, they set up camp on a small plateau. The wind was sharp and cold. Hollis built a fire in a shelter made of stones. Diana helped him and, at the same time, managed to work on some small part, a tiny gear. She twirled it between her fingers and filed down the edges with a stone. Caden sat by the fire. Hera sat next to Aaron, without touching her, but close. Closer than she sat with the others. Irene was quietly telling her about the herbs that grow in the mountains. Hera listened. For the first time all day, something other than emptiness appeared on her face. Minjun sat a little to the side. Yuna slept on her lap. Minjun was cleaning her sword, slowly, methodically. Not because the sword was dirty, because her hands had to be occupied. Otherwise, her mind would start asking questions she wasn't yet ready to seek answers. Caden took a small bundle out of his bag, made of paper. He unwrapped it. Inside was tea, dried leaves with a subtle bitter scent, midnight silver, a rare variety grown in only one province. The province would fall to his Nanka in 2 days. This tea would be the last in the world. Caden put it back in his bag. The tea wasn't for him. It was for Soyan. She loved this variety. He knew that from his past life. She'd mentioned it once, in passing, not thinking anyone would remember, but he had. Minjun looked up from her sword. She glanced at the bag, then at Caden. She said they had 2 days until something he wasn't talking about, and that she wasn't a fool. Caden replied that he knew. She asked why he wouldn't tell her then. He said he would. When everyone was safe, she asked, "Who is everyone?" He answered, "It's us, and 2 more. Minjung fell silent. Then she said that if he made a mistake and everyone died, she'd come back from the dead and kill him herself. Caden almost smiled. He said he'd already come back once. It was unpleasant. She looked at him. for a long time. Then she shook her head and went back to her sword. That night, Caden lay on the rocks and gazed at the sky. The stars were bright and cold. In 2 days, they wouldn't be visible anymore. Hera was breathing nearby. She wasn't asleep. She was whispering something, quietly, like a prayer, or like a lullaby. Caden listened closely. She was whispering names, the names of the novices, all 30 of them. She was listing them one by one, over and over, so she wouldn't forget. Caden closed his eyes. 2 days. Caden had taken Hara Jung from the Whitewater Convent 2 hours before the convent burst into flames from the rupture of the third vein of the world. The whole group saw the glow, and Minjung began to realize the extent of Caden's knowledge. The veins are rupturing earlier than in his past life, and the map of the future is fading faster. Caden is keeping a packet of tea for Soyeon Han, whom he plans to intercept on the 6th day. The 6th day began with a silence that felt wrong. Caden opened his eyes and immediately realized that something had changed. The birds were silent, not a single one. No cries, no whistles, no rustling of wings. The mountains were dead and silent as a crypt. He stood up. The air was heavy and thick, like before a storm, but without clouds. The sky above the gray mountains was clear, blue, and empty, unnaturally empty. Caden pressed his palm against a rock. The tremor became a pulse, rhythmic, fast. The 4th and 5th veins of the world had burst during the night. He hadn't sensed the moment. He'd simply woken up and the world had grown thinner, like a fabric about to tear. He broke camp. Everyone moved in silence. Even Diana wasn't joking. Something hung in the air and everyone could feel it. Not through the prophet's gift, but simply with their bodies, just as animals sense an earthquake before the first tremor. The caravan moved up the trail. Caden walked quickly, faster than yesterday. Minjung didn't ask why. She looked at the sky and the mountains, and her hand never left the hilt of her sword. Hera walked beside the last wagon. Her lips moved silently. She heard something the others couldn't hear. Caden knew what it was. The walls of the world were singing, louder and louder. By noon, they reached the pass. The wind here was icy and cut across their faces like a razor. Below, beyond the pass, lay a valley, and beyond the valley ran a road. An old one, paved with stone back in the days of the first emperors, the road from the capital to the north. In a few hours, a woman carrying a bag full of books would walk along this road. Caden stopped the caravan and told Minjun that he was going down, alone. This time, she didn't argue. She just nodded. He noticed that she was standing in such a way that she could see all the approaches to the camp at once. A professional habit. Or a new one, born of the realization that the world had become more dangerous than she'd thought. Caden made his way down into the valley within an hour. The road was empty. He sat down on a rock by the roadside and waited. Time passed. The sun moved. The shadows shifted. In her past life, Soyeon had left the capital at dawn on the 6th day, on horseback, alone, without an escort. She wasn't fleeing out of foreboding. She was fleeing a scandal. She had been accused of stealing documents from the Imperial Archives, documents she hadn't stolen but had copied, because they contained information about ancient hideouts. Soyeon didn't believe in the end of the world. She was simply an archivist who had found an interesting text and wanted to study it. For that, they were going to arrest her. She found out an hour before her arrest and fled. Caden was waiting. 2 hours later, a speck appeared on the road. A horse, a rider, a small figure in a dark cloak, a bag on her back, heavy, stuffed with something square and dense. Books. Caden got up from the rock and stepped out onto the road. The horse stopped. The woman pulled on the reins and looked at him. 24 years old, dark eyes behind her glasses, a narrow, weary face. Her hair had slipped out from under her hood. Soyeon Khan. She asked who he was and what he was doing on a deserted road in the middle of the mountains. Her voice was even and cold. Palace training. Even on the run, she spoke as if she were sitting at a desk in the archives. Caden gave his name. He said he knew who she was. He knew she was fleeing the capital. He knew she had copies of documents from the ancient refuges section in her bag. And he knew that in a day, the capital would cease to exist, and the theft charge would be the least of her problems. Soyeon didn't move. She looked at him through her glasses. Then she asked how he knew all this. He replied that he'd explain later. Right now, she had to decide. To keep going down this road and freeze to death in a ditch in 2 days because the road would end in a landslide. Or to go with him up into the mountains where there was a camp, people, and a chance. Soyeon was silent for a long time, a minute, two. Then she said she didn't trust people who knew too much. He replied that she was right to do so. She asked, why then should she trust him? He took a small bundle out of his pocket. He unwrapped it. Dried leaves with a subtle, bitter scent. Silver Midnight, her favorite tea. He said he'd found it in a shop in Holmgard 3 days ago, the last pack. In 2 days, the province where it's grown would cease to exist. This was the last Silver Midnight in the world. Soyeon looked at the leaves, then at Kaden, then back at the leaves. She asked quietly how he knew it was her favorite tea. He replied that she had told him. She said she'd never seen it before. He said it was complicated, and that there was no time to explain. There was time to ride. Soyeon put the tea in her bag. She dismounted. She looked at the pass. She looked at the road behind her. Then she said she'd go with him, but if this was a trap, she knew 3 ways to kill a man with a sharpened quill, and 2 of them were painful. Kaden nodded and led her uphill. The climb took an hour and a half. Soyeon walked in silence. She didn't complain. She didn't ask questions. Only when they came out onto the plateau where the camp was set up, she stopped and surveyed the group. 4 wagons, a campfire, people. Hollis was repairing a wheel. Diana was sitting by the brazier, soldering something. Areen was sorting through the supplies. Minjung was standing on a rock, looking east. Yuna was sleeping on one of the wagons. Hara was sitting on the ground with her palms facing upward. Soyeon looked at Kaden and said this didn't look like an army. He replied that it wasn't an army, it was a family that didn't know each other yet. She raised an eyebrow and said that was the strangest thing she'd heard all week, including the accusation of treason. Kaden almost smiled. That evening, by the campfire, Kaden decided it was time. Not the whole truth, just part of it. Enough so that they would stop asking small questions and ask one big one instead. He said that tomorrow, the world would change. Everyone looked at him. Minjung stopped cleaning her sword. Aideen looked up from the herbs. Diana set down her gear. Hollis froze with a mug in his hand. Hera lowered her palms. Soyeon took off her glasses and wiped them. Yuna woke up at the silence and snuggled up to her sister. Kaden spoke calmly and quietly. He said that tomorrow the veins of the world would burst, all of them, at the same time. From the rifts will come what the ancients called the Iznanka. The capital will fall. The temples will burn. The empire will cease to exist overnight. Of the 300 million inhabitants, less than 2% will remain a year from now. The silence lasted a long time. Hollis was the first to speak. He asked how he knew this. Kaiden replied that he was a prophet, not a temple prophet, but a real one. Hollis asked how he could be sure Kaiden was a real prophet. Minjung spoke up before Kaiden could answer. She listed the evidence. The ring in the tavern, the caravan, the boat sent after Yuna before their meeting, the monastery that burst into flames 2 hours after Kaiden took Hira. Every time he knew. Exactly. Down to the hour. Down to the minute. Minjung didn't look at Kaiden while she spoke. She stared into the fire. Her voice was steady, a list of facts, no emotion. But her hands were clenching the scabbard so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Aideen asked quietly why he hadn't warned more people. Kaiden replied that he had warned them. He'd been warning them for 8 years. They'd laughed at him. Then they'd arrested him. Then they'd left him to die in a dungeon. Aideen fell silent. Soyeon spoke up. She said the documents in her bag contained a description of an SSS-rank shelter built by a civilization that had survived something similar thousands of years ago. Everyone looked at her. She said she hadn't believed it when she read it. Now she was starting to believe it. Kaiden nodded and said the shelter existed. He knew where it was. They were going there. By tomorrow morning, they'd be at the entrance, and when the world behind them collapsed, they'd be inside. Diana asked, "What about everyone else?" Her voice wavered. She was thinking of her neighbors in Brannon, of the old woman who sold her thread, of the boy who ran to fetch water for the blacksmith shop. Kaiden answered, he couldn't save everyone, he could save them. He chose them, each one by name, for a reason, because of what they could bring to the new world after the old one ended. Diana turned away. Kaiden saw her shoulders shaking. Hollis placed his hand on her back, heavy, hot, the hand of a blacksmith who forges metal, but now it simply lay there, holding her. Minjung stood up. She looked down at Kaiden. She said that if he turned out to be right tomorrow, she would follow him to the very end, and if not, she fell silent. Then she said he would be right. She already knew that, and that made it worse. She walked off into the darkness. Yuna ran after her. Hera raised her palms. She spread her fingers. She said quietly that the walls of the world were screaming. They're no longer singing, they're screaming. Kaiden nodded. He pressed his palm to the ground. The tremor was constant, unceasing, like the planet's fever. He said they'd set out at dawn. Everyone nodded. No one slept. The last day began with a red sky. Not the red of dawn, a different kind. Dark, heavy, as if someone had smeared blood across the horizon. Caden stood at the edge of the plateau and looked east. There, beyond the mountains, lay a world that in a few hours would cease to exist. Hillgard, the capital, the 7 temples, 300 million people who woke up this morning not knowing it would be their last morning. Caden turned away. He couldn't think about 300 million. He could think about 8. He broke camp. Everyone moved quickly, silently, without questions. After yesterday's conversation by the campfire, something had changed. The group was no longer just a collection of strangers hired by a strange man. It had become something else, something that didn't yet have a name. The caravan made its way up the final stretch of the trail. The path here was barely visible. Rocks, scree, narrow passages between the cliffs. The horses struggled to make their way. One of the wagons got a wheel stuck in a crevice. Hollis and Minjun pulled it out in 2 minutes. No one said a word. They simply did it and moved on. Caden walked ahead, counting his steps. He remembered the path, every rock, every turn. In a past life, he had seen this path as a ghost, formless, weightless, floating above the rocks and through the cliffs. Now, he was walking on his own 2 feet, and his legs ached. A good kind of pain, a living pain. By noon, the trail led them to a wall, a smooth cliff 20 times a man's height, gray, without a single crack, without a single ledge, as if the mountain had been cut off with a knife. The caravan stopped. Everyone stared at the wall. Hollis said this was a dead end. Caden didn't answer. He walked up to the rock and placed both palms on it. He closed his eyes. He felt it. Not the tremor of the world. Something else. Deeper. Older. Beneath the stone flowed an energy that wasn't found in the veins of the world. Alien. Ancient. Left behind by a civilization that was here before the empire. Before the continent. Before everything. Caden ran his fingers over the stone. He found a line, a thin one, invisible to the eye but palpable to his fingertips. He traced it to the right. The line led him to a point at chest level. He stopped. He pulled out his knife. He slit his palm. Blood welled up, bright and hot. He pressed his palm against the stone. The blood was absorbed. It didn't spread across the surface. It seeped inside, like water into sand. The rock shuddered. A rumble traveled through the stone, through the earth, through the bones. Minjung grabbed her sword. Hollis took a step back. Diana, on the other hand, stepped forward and stared at the rock with her mouth agape. A line appeared in the stone, vertical, from the ground to the very top. Then another one, horizontal, a rectangle. A door. 5 human heights tall and 3 wide. The stone inside the rectangle slowly slid inward and to the side. Behind it, a corridor opened up. Wide, high, lit by a soft bluish light emanating from the walls themselves. The air inside was warm and clean and smelled of something metallic and ancient. Everyone stood there, watching. Caden turned to face them. He said it was an SSS-rank shelter, built thousands of years ago. It could withstand anything. They had to go in. Now. Minjung was the first to step toward the door. She looked inside. Then, she turned around and nodded. She grabbed Yuna and went inside. 18 followed. Hera stopped at the threshold. She raised her palms, spread her fingers. She stood like that for a few seconds. Then, she said it was quiet inside. The walls here don't scream. Here, they sleep. She went inside. Soyeon walked in without looking back, businesslike, as if she were entering an archive, a bag of books slung over her shoulder. Diana grabbed her father by the hand and dragged him inside. Hollis resisted, not out of fear. He needed to tend to the horses. Caden helped him herd the wagon train into the corridor. The wagons barely squeezed through. The horses snorted and shook their heads. They didn't like the air here, but they kept going. When the last wagon rolled inside, Caden stood at the entrance and looked back. Mountains. The sky. A red, heavy, sickly sky. A line appeared on the horizon to the east. Black, thin, like a crack in glass. Caden stared at it. It was growing, slowly, widening, creeping across the sky from the horizon upward. The first fissure. The world's lifeline, 100 miles to the south, had just burst. Caden turned away and entered the shelter. He placed his palm against the inner wall. The door began to close. The stone moved slowly and silently. The gap narrowed, the light from outside dimmed. At the last moment, before the door closed completely, Caden saw the crack in the sky branch out, like lightning, like the roots of a tree. Black lines raced across the red sky in all directions. Then the stone came to a stop, and there was nothing left outside. Silence. The blue glow of the walls. Warm air. Caden stood facing the closed door. He breathed. He counted his heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. It worked. They were inside. He turned around. The group was standing in the hallway, looking at him. 8 pairs of eyes. 9, counting the horses, but horses don't count. He said they needed to go further inside. The hallway wasn't a place to set up camp. They moved deeper inside. The hallway ran straight ahead, then turned and led them into a hall. Huge. The ceiling was lost in the darkness. The walls glowed with the same bluish light. The floor was smooth and warm. In the center of the hall stood a fountain, dry, made of stone, 1,000 years old. Caden knew the water could be turned on, but later. To the right of the hall ran a gallery, long, with windows, real windows, carved into the rock and overlooking the valley below. Caden led the group toward the gallery. They stepped out onto an observation deck. Far, far below lay the world. Holmgard was visible as a cluster of dots on the coast. Beyond it stretched the sea. On a clear day, one could see the southern shores beyond the sea. But the day was not clear. The sky was ablaze, not with fire, but with blackness. The cracks were multiplying, spreading, weaving together into a web that covered the sky from horizon to horizon. The sunlight passed through this web, shattering and shifting. It grew dim, lifeless, like light through soot-stained glass. Everyone stood at the windows and watched. No one spoke. Holmgard was the first to go out. Not with an explosion, not in a fire. The light simply began to fade, from the edges toward the center, as if someone were blowing out candles one by one, slowly, carefully. The harbor lights, the street torches, the windows of the houses, one after another. Caden knew what was happening. The inside was sweeping through the city. It didn't break things. It didn't burn them. It erased, like an eraser on a drawing. Wherever it passed, nothing remained. No walls, no streets, no people. Only emptiness. A smooth, black emptiness that was neither earth, nor water, nor air. Minjun stood by the window. Tears streamed down her face. She didn't wipe them away. She didn't blink. She just stood there and watched as the world in which she was born and raised, fought, loved, and hated, ceased to exist. Yuna clung to her, trembling. Erin stood next to Caden. At one point, she took his hand. Without looking, without saying a word, she simply found his hand and squeezed it. Her fingers were cold, so were his. Diana was holding a piece of metal in her hand, a small one, a fragment of the gear she'd been working on yesterday. She was clenching it so tightly that the edges were cutting into her skin. Blood was dripping onto the floor. She didn't notice. Hera stood with her eyes closed, whispering names. Not the novices' names, other names, many, hundreds. She could hear them, those who were dying down below. Her gift allowed her to sense emotional traces, and right now the world below was choking on fear, pain, and confusion. She could hear it all. She was taking it all in. She was trembling and whispering, her eyes still closed. Soyeon stood slightly to the side, her glasses in her hand, eyes closed, face impassive. She wasn't crying. She was counting. Caden knew this. She was counting how many archives were burning right now, how many books were vanishing, how much knowledge the world was losing at this very moment. That was her grief. Not people, not cities, knowledge. Because she didn't know how to love people, but she had loved knowledge her whole life. The fires were dying out, one by one, city after city. In the distance to the south, a white glow flared up, then another. Temples. The 7 temples were burning. The 7 pillars of faith of the Velgard Empire turned into white fire and were extinguished within minutes. The oracles, who for 200 years had proclaimed that the world was eternal, burned along with their prophecies. The silence lasted an hour. For a whole hour, they stood at the windows and watched. No one sat down. No one left. No one uttered a word. Then the last fire on the horizon flickered and went out. Distant. Lonely. Perhaps a lighthouse on a cape. Perhaps the last lantern in the last house of the last city. The darkness below was complete. Not the darkness of night, where there are stars and the moon and hope for dawn. The darkness of the other side. Absolute. Bottomless. Caden stood and gazed into that darkness. Erin's hand was in his. He opened his mouth. The words came out softly. Not for them. For the darkness. For the world that was no more. For the Duke who had left him to die. For the crowd that had laughed as he was flogged in the square. For everyone who had heard his warning and turned away. He said, "I told you." And the last fire went out. The group reached the refuge, and Caden opened the door with his blood as a prophet. They entered, and the door closed behind them. Standing on the observation gallery, all 8 of them watched as Iznanko wiped out Homeguard and the Velgard Empire in a single hour. Each grieved the world's destruction in their own way. Caden spoke into the darkness his final words to the old world. No one slept that first night in the refuge. Technically, there was no night. The blue light on the walls did not change. It did not dim. It didn't flicker. Constant, steady. The dead light of a dead civilization for the living who didn't know what to do with themselves. Caden was the first to leave the observation gallery. The others stood there for a long time. He didn't call them. Each had their own way of saying goodbye to the world, and he couldn't rush them. He walked through the corridors. The shelter was enormous, larger than he remembered from the ghostly visions of his past life. Back then, he'd seen only fragments, the entrance, the main hall, the gallery, a few corridors. Now he was walking on his own 2 feet, and the sheer scale of it all weighed heavily on him. 3 levels up. Who knew how many down? The lower levels were sealed off. Heavy doors made of a metal Caden didn't recognize. No keyholes, no handles. Smooth, cold, with symbols that didn't belong to any language of the Empire. He stood in front of one of these doors and pressed his palm against it. Nothing. Not even a tremor. No response. Whatever was behind those doors was asleep, and it wasn't going to wake up from a touch. Not yet, anyway. Caden returned to the upper levels and set to work. First, water. The fountain in the main hall. He remembered there was water here, an underground spring. He needed to find the mechanism. He found it, behind the fountain. A lever, made of stone, heavy. Hollis helped turn it. The fountain coughed, spat out rusty sludge. Then it began to flow. Clean, cold water. It smelled of stone and iron and something ancient, but it was clean. Second, the rooms. The upper level had dozens of rooms, small, square, with stone couches. Cells. Caden chose and assigned them. For Hollis and Diana, next to each other. For Minjin and Yuna, next to each other. For Soyeon, farther away from the others. She loved the silence. For Hera, in a corner where the walls were thicker. It was quietest there. Her gift of hearing could drive her mad in a place where every stone remembered millennia. For Aeryn, Caden searched for a long time. He passed through 20 rooms, 30, and he found it. A small room on the 2nd level, with a window. The only room with a window besides the observation gallery. The window didn't face outward. It looked into a vertical shaft that rose all the way to the very top of the mountain. Light streamed through it. Real light. Sunlight, or what was left of it. Dim, scattered, but real. Caden stood in that room and looked at the patch of light on the floor. Aeryn had spent 4 months in refugee camps where there were no windows, no light, and no gratitude. She deserved a window. He had prepared the room. He found bales of fabric in one of the storage rooms. 1,000-year-old fabric. Strange to the touch. Neither cotton nor silk. Something in between. It hadn't decayed over the centuries. It hadn't yellowed. It had simply lain there, waiting. He spread it out on the cot. He found a water jug. He brought fresh water from the fountain. Then he did something else. From the wagon's supplies, he took out the clay he'd bought at the market in Homeguard on the first day. No one had asked him back then why he needed clay. He molded a plate out of it, a simple one, rough, round, with slightly raised edges and a small pattern of dots around the rim, just like the plate from Irene's childhood. She had told him about it in her past life, 3 days before her death, lying on the ground, too weak to get up. She spoke of home, of the kitchen, of the plate with dots from which she ate porridge every morning. He remembered. The plate was uneven, the clay had dried crooked, the pattern had turned out rough. But it was that plate, that shape, those dots. Caden placed it on the edge of the cot and left. When Aideen found her room, she stood in the doorway for 2 minutes. She looked at the window, at the light, at the plate. Then she sat down on the bench. She took the plate in her hands. She ran her finger over the dots and didn't say a word. She just sat there, holding it. Caden walked past half an hour later. The door was open. Aideen was sitting in the same position, the plate in her hands. Her eyes were wet. She lifted her head and looked at him. There was a question in her gaze, a huge one, an impossible one. How do you know? How do you know about the plate with the dots? I never told anyone. Never. Only Mom. Mom's been gone for 10 years. How do you know? Caden didn't answer. He nodded and walked on. The first 3 days in the shelter were spent working. Caden assigned tasks. Hollis inspected the utility rooms. He found a forge, an ancient one, with a furnace that ran on the shelter's energy. Not coal, not firewood, pure heat from the walls. Hollis stood in front of that furnace, and his hands were shaking, not from fear, from anticipation. Diana found a workshop next to the forge, tools she'd never seen before, delicate, precise, made for the work she dreamed of. She grabbed one of them and ran her finger along the blade, perfectly sharpened. 1,000 years later, she laughed. The first laugh in the shelter, sharp and ringing. The echo carried it through the corridors. Adrian discovered a room on the second level filled with soil, artificial, specially prepared, with an irrigation system that also ran on the shelter's energy, a greenhouse. She began planting seeds from her stash, roots, grasses, medicinal plants. The soil was strange, rich, dark, but the seeds took root. On the third day, the first sprouts broke through the surface. Minjun took charge of security. She walked every corridor, every door, every corner. She mapped out the shelter in her mind. She found 3 exits besides the main one. 2 were blocked with rocks. The third opened onto a narrow ledge high up in the mountains. Ventilation, or an emergency exit. She placed a marker by each one, a stone of a specific shape, so they could be found by touch in the dark. Yuna helped with everything. She carried water, she handed tools, she ran through the corridors with a torch, even though the walls glowed and the torch wasn't needed. She was 16, and the world outside the shelter's walls had ceased to exist, but she was with her sister. That was enough. Hera sat in her room most of the time. She wasn't hiding, she was getting used to it. The shelter's walls were steeped in millennia of emotional traces. People had lived here before them, long ago, a very long time ago. Hera could hear their echoes, fragments like whispers from behind a wall in a language she didn't know. She was getting used to those whispers. She was learning to distinguish them from her own thoughts. Soyeon found the archive on the 3rd level. It was small, just a few shelves with stone tablets and scrolls made of a material resembling thin metal. The texts were in a language she didn't know, but the structure was familiar. She recognized the roots, the ancient forms of words that later became the foundation of the continent's languages. She sat down at the table and began her work. 2 days later, she had deciphered the first 3 tablets. They contained operating instructions for the shelter. She brought them to Caden. He read them. Life support systems, water supply, lighting, temperature control, and a mention of the lower levels. Sealed, with a note that Soyeon translated as, "Do not open until the contents are fully understood." Caden folded the plaques and returned them to her. He said the lower levels would have to wait. She looked at him and said he knew what was down there. He replied that he didn't. He didn't know. He knew there was something down there and that they weren't ready yet. She asked what for. He didn't answer. The 12th day, evening. Caden gathered everyone in the main hall. He said he wanted to give them something. He took 6 small bundles out of his belongings. Each was wrapped in cloth. He handed them out in silence. Minjung unwrapped hers, a silver bracelet, delicate, engraved. She recognized it, Yuna's bracelet. Their mother had given it to Yuna for her 10th birthday. Yuna had lost it 3 years ago at the fair. She'd cried for a week. Minjung looked at Caden. He said he'd found it in a junk shop in Homeguard on the first day. Minjung opened her mouth. Then she closed it. She handed the bracelet to Yuna. Yuna grabbed it with both hands and pressed it to her chest. Aiden unwrapped her bundle. Seeds. Tiny. Silvery. A rare herb she'd been searching for her whole life. Moonroot. It grows only in a single gorge in the south, a gorge that no longer exists. Aiden held the seeds in the palm of her hand and gazed at them as if they were a miracle. Diana unfolded a sheet of paper, a blueprint, a mechanism, gears, springs, and levers. The lines were uneven, childlike, but precise. She recognized the handwriting. Her father had drawn this for her when she was 7. A toy music box. He promised to make it. He didn't. He lost the blueprint. He forgot. Diana held the paper, her hands trembling. She looked at her father. Hollis was looking at the sketch. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were wet. He slowly nodded to his daughter. Once. Hara turned over a small wooden lantern, not the one she'd taken from the monastery, another one, exactly the same, from her home village, with moons on either side. She held them both in her hands and pressed them to her chest. 2 lanterns, one old one that she had kept, one new one that a man she had known for 12 days had found for her. Soyan opened a book, a thin one, with a leather cover, in a language that no one in Velgart spoke, her native language, the language of a small province on the outskirts that had always been too small and too poor for anyone to remember it. A book of poetry. Soyan took off her glasses, wiped them, put them back on, opened the first page. She read for 3 seconds. She closed the book. She closed her eyes. Caden saw her lips tremble. Madison. Caden handed her the last bundle. She unwrapped it. A flag, small, tattered, blue with a white star, the flag of the Republic of Brilliant. She found it in the bundle and froze. Caden said he'd taken it from one of the last ships in Homeguard Harbor the day before the harbor burned down. Madison pressed the flag to her face. The fabric smelled of salt and the sea and a home that was no longer there. No one said a word. 10 minutes, maybe longer. Caden didn't count. He just stood there and watched them, the 6 people he'd pulled from under the wheels of the world. To each of them, he'd brought a small piece of the past, not because the past is more important than the future, but because a person needs an anchor, proof that they existed before the catastrophe, that there was a world, that there was a home, that there were things that was a home, that there were things that mattered. Without that, a person isn't a person, just a survivor. For the first 12 days in the shelter, the group settled into their new space. Caden found the only room with a window for Aideen and made a plate based on her childhood. Everyone found their place and their purpose. Caden discovered the sealed lower levels, marked with a warning in an ancient language. On the 12th day, he handed each person an item from their past, and everyone fell silent for 10 minutes. The first month in the shelter was quiet. Not peaceful, quiet. Those are different things. Peace is when there's nothing to fear. Silence is when you're afraid but don't know what of. The world outside the walls was silent. From the observation gallery, the valley was visible, but there was nothing to look at. The other side had covered everything. A black void stretched from horizon to horizon. Not darkness, it can be illuminated. It was an absence, as if someone had cut out a piece of reality and left a hole. Sometimes, something stirred in that hole, distant, indistinct. Minjin was the first to see it. She was standing on the gallery at night when she couldn't sleep. She saw movement below, slow, smooth, as if something very large was gliding beneath the surface of the other side, like a fish under the ice. She told Caden about it in the morning. He nodded. He said he knew. The other side isn't empty. But for now, whatever is in there isn't interested in them. For now. Life inside the shelter was taking shape. Not quickly, bit by bit, like a mosaic pieced together in the dark by touch. Hollis worked in the forge every day. The horn, which drew its energy from the walls, gave off a steady, constant heat. Perfect. Better than any coal. Hollis made what was needed. Hooks, loops, brackets for shelves, brackets for torches, even though the walls glowed on their own, out of habit. Diana worked beside him, but not beside him as an apprentice, beside him as an equal. At her own forge, with her own tools, she made locks for the doors, latches for storage rooms, mechanisms to supply water to distant rooms. Each lock was a small work of art. The gears meshed with a precision that made Hollis freeze and watch. He didn't tell her she was talented. He didn't know how. But one day, in the 3rd week, he picked up one of her locks, turned it over in his hands, checked the mechanism, and put it back, silently. Then he nodded, just once. Diana stood there with the pliers in her hand, motionless. Then she turned abruptly toward the horn. Caden saw it from the hallway. He saw her shoulders trembling. But this was a different kind of tremor, not from grief. Aideen harvested her first crop 3 weeks later. Herbs and roots for medicinal tinctures, greens for food. The moonroot seeds sprouted on the 4th day and grew faster than she'd expected. The soil in the shelter was saturated with something that accelerated growth. Aideen didn't understand what it was, but she accepted it. She'd learned to cook, not just mix ingredients, to cook, with whatever was available, grain from the pack, dried meat, herbs from her garden. She fed everyone twice a day, silently, methodically, without a single word about how tired she was. Caden noticed this in the 2nd week. That evening, he came into the kitchen they'd set up in one of the rooms on the 2nd level. Aideen was washing the pot. Her hands were red from the hot water. Caden took the pot from her. He told her she wasn't working today. She said she still needed to sort through the roots for tomorrow's decoction. He said the roots could wait. She said the sick wouldn't wait. He said there were no sick people. Everyone was healthy. She could rest. Aideen stood there looking at him, as if he'd said something in a foreign language. Rest. A word she understood, but didn't know how to apply to herself. Caden led her into the room. A patch of light from the shaft fell on the wall. Evening light. Warm. He brought her dinner on that very same plate with dots on it. He set a jug of water and a herbal tea he'd made himself next to it. It was a bit wonky, not as neat as she would have made it, but he'd made it. Aideen sat on the cot, holding the plate. He left. She didn't call him back, but in the morning, she looked at him differently, like a riddle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve, because the answer might be one she couldn't turn away from. Minjung trained every day. She found a hall of the right size on the first level. She hauled wooden beams from the storage room out there. She rigged up something resembling training equipment. She began practicing. Morning and evening. Sword, shield, hand-to-hand combat with her shadow. Yuna watched. Then she asked to be taught. Minjung gave her a stick and showed her the basic stance. Yuna was thin and weak, but stubborn. After 2 weeks, she could hold the stance for 10 minutes without trembling. Minjung didn't praise her. She just nodded and demonstrated the next move. One day, Caden walked into the hall and told Minjung that in 3 days he was planning his first expedition. She asked where. He replied that they were going to the surface, to the nearest slopes, to check what was left and see if there was access to the nearby caves where communities of miners had survived in their past lives. Minjung said she would go with him. He nodded. He said he wouldn't take anyone else. She agreed. In the 3rd month, they went out for the first time. The main entrance opened easily. Caden pressed his palm against it. Blood. The stone slid aside. The light from outside was strange. Not sunlight, not moonlight. Gray, even. As if they'd forgotten to paint the sky. The air smelled of metal and dust and something bitter. Caden took a breath and coughed. Minjung stood beside him, her hand on her sword. Her eyes scanned the slope. The mountains were still there, the rocks, the trees. But the trees were different. Gray, leafless, as if dried out from the inside. Caden touched the trunk of the nearest pine tree. It crumbled. It simply turned into gray powder at his touch. Minjung watched. She said it was fun. Her voice was even. Caden knew this wasn't fun. It was her way of coping. They made their way down the slope. They found a trail. They walked for 3 hours. They found a cave. The entrance was open. It was dark inside. Minjung lit a torch. Caden went in first. The cave wasn't very deep, and there were people inside. 11 people. Alive. Filthy. Emaciated. Men and women. Miners. Blacksmiths. The very ones. They barricaded themselves in the mine on the day of the fall, and had been trapped there for 3 months. They'd survived on the supplies kept in the mine for the work shifts. Water trickled down the walls from an underground spring. They'd survived, barely. The eldest among them, a man with a scorched face and calloused hands, looked at Caden and asked what was happening outside. Caden replied that the Empire had fallen, that the Iznanka had covered the lowlands, that it was still safe in the mountains, that he had a shelter, food, water, a place. The man asked what the price was. Caden replied, work. Everyone does what they know how to do. Blacksmiths forge, miners dig, everyone eats. The man stared at him for a minute. Then he stood up. He turned to his people. They stood up one by one, staggering, holding onto the walls. Caden led them upstairs. Minjung brought up the rear, hand on her sword, eyes on the shadows. When they returned to the shelter, Aideen was already cooking. She saw 11 people, thin, dirty, sick. She didn't say a word. She brought out a larger pot. An hour later, everyone had been fed. 3 hours later, they were treatments. Burns, cuts, 2 with the onset of fever. Aideen worked calmly and precisely, as always. Caden stood nearby and handed her the instruments. She didn't ask. He just knew what was needed. When the last patient fell asleep, Aideen sat down on the floor. She closed her eyes. Caden sat down beside her. He said quietly that she was doing everything right. She opened her eyes and looked at him. She asked quietly how he knew about the plate. Caden remained silent. She said that her mother had made the plate with dots around the rim for her, from clay gathered from the riverbank. No one but her mother knew about that pattern. Her mother had died 10 years ago. Aideen had never told anyone about it. Caden replied that she had told him, once. Aideen said that was impossible because she'd seen him for the first time at the market in Homeguard. Caden replied that it was true, and that he couldn't explain it. Not yet, anyway. She looked at him for a long time. Then she stood up. She went to her room. She stopped at the threshold. She said she didn't know who he was, but whatever he was a good person. That's what she feels. She left. Caden sat on the floor of the empty room and listened to the silence of the refuge. 19 people now, 8 of his own, 11 newcomers. Months lay ahead, years, the lower levels, sealed doors, and a question to which he still had no answer. Why didn't the other side touch the shelter? Why did it stand in the middle of the black void like an island in the sea? What did it want from them? What did it want from him? In the first few months, the shelter found its rhythm of life. Irene began asking direct questions about the plate, and Caden couldn't answer. For the first time, Hollis silently approved of Diana's work. In the third month, Caden and Minjun made their first foray and found 11 surviving miners in the mine. The shelter's community had grown to 19 people. The sixth month, the shelter was breathing. Not a metaphor, literally. The walls were pulsing, barely noticeable. Every few minutes, the blue light would grow slightly brighter and then fade slightly, like the inhalation and exhalation of a huge stone lung. Caden was the first to notice it, then Heda. She came to him early in the morning, if one could even call it morning based on their internal clocks rather than the light from the walls, which never changed. She said the walls had woken up. Caden asked what she meant. She replied that for the first few months, the walls had been asleep. She could feel it, an ancient sleep, a deep one. Now they slept more lightly, as if something had woken them, or someone. She looked at Caden and said that the walls were reacting to him, to his presence. When he walks down the hallway, the light shifts slightly. She'd checked. She'd followed him at a distance and watched. His footsteps awakened the sanctuary. Caden stood and listened. He knew it had to do with his blood, with his prophetic gift. The door opened with his blood. The sanctuary had recognized him as a prophet, and now it was reacting. Not threateningly, but not indifferently either, like a host who has woken up and is walking around the house, not yet having decided whether to send the guests away or not. Caden told Hara that she should keep an eye on it. If the wall started changing faster or in any other way, she should let him know immediately. She nodded. Then she asked what he was afraid of waking up. He replied that he didn't know. She said he did know. He remained silent. She left. Small, quiet, with 2 flashlights in the pockets of her robe. The community was growing. By the 6th month, 37 people were living in the shelter, 11 miners from the first expedition, 5 refugees found at the mountain pass during the second, a family of 3 picked up by Minjun on the third, and a group of 8 former guards discovered in a half-ruined fortress on the mountainside. The guardsmen were more complicated. They were armed, disciplined, and accustomed to giving orders, not taking them. Their senior captain was Rand Weiss, tall, lean, a scar across his entire forehead. He wore the uniform of the former Imperial Guard, torn and dirty, but he still wore it as a dress uniform. Caden saw him and recognized him, not by his face, but by the scar, by his hands, by the way he stood, leaning slightly forward, like a man ready to strike. In a past life, Caden had seen those hands. They had held a whip. The dungeons of the Merrywall Citadel, an interrogation, 3 days. Rand Weiss was one of those who had tortured him on the Duke's orders. Not the leader, just an enforcer. He did what he was told, without pleasure, but without hesitation, professionally. Caden stood facing Rand and counted his heartbeats. 1, 2, 3, 4. Rand didn't recognize him. Back then, in the dungeon, Caden had been beaten and covered in blood. His face had been swollen. Now he looked different, healthy, calm, with a steady gaze, a different person. Minjun stood nearby. She sensed that something wasn't right. She saw how Caden changed when he saw the guards, how his shoulders stiffened, how his jaw clenched. She placed her hand on the hilt of her sword and stepped a little closer to him. Caden told himself, no, not now, not here. This man knows how to lead. He knows how to organize a defense. He knows how to train fighters. The community needs this. Personal matters can wait. He held out his hand to Rand, introduced himself, offered a place in the refuge, work, food, safety, in exchange for discipline and obedience to the common rules. Rand looked at his hand, at the refuge behind him, at his people, hungry, exhausted. He shook his hand. Caden squeezed his palm a little tighter than necessary, for half a second longer than necessary. Rand looked into his eyes. He saw nothing, or didn't want to see anything. Minju noticed. That evening, after everyone had left, she went to see Caden. She asked what the story was with the captain. Caden replied that there was no story. She said he was lying. He replied that he was. She waited. He didn't continue. She said that someday he would tell her. He replied, maybe. She nodded and left. She stopped at the door. She turned around. She said she'd seen him clench the captain's hand, that if Caden ever decided to unclench it in the other direction, she'd be right there. Then she left. Caden stood alone. He pressed his palms against the wall. A blue light pulsed. Inhale, exhale. The shelter breathed with him. He thought of Rand, of the dungeon, about the whip, about the darkness in which he had died. He thought and felt no hatred. That frightened him more than hatred. Madison showed up the next day. Caden hadn't planned for her. She was the only one of the 6 he couldn't have foreseen. In his past life, he'd learned of her too late. The daughter of a merchant ship captain from the overseas Republic of Brilliant. Her father's ship had burned in Holmgard Harbor on the first day of the fall. She had been on shore. She had seen everything. Caden couldn't have prevented it. Too many variables, too little time. Madison found refuge on her own. No one understood how she had survived 6 months out there. She came to the entrance, filthy, thin, in a tattered dress, with a burned hand, and with a smile that made Minjun's jaw drop. Madison stood by the sealed door and pounded her fist against the stone. She shouted that if anyone was inside, she could use some hot soup and a clean shirt, and that she was willing to pay with the story of how she'd lived in a tree for 3 weeks because something big and slimy was roaming the ground. Hera heard her pounding through the walls. She brought Caden over. He opened the door. Madison looked up at him. She was small. Her light hair was dirty and tangled. Her eyes were blue, bright, unnaturally bright for someone who'd spent 6 months surviving in a dead world. She asked who he was. He introduced himself. She said she had no money, but had 3 very good jokes and was willing to wash dishes. Caden stepped back and let her in. Madison walked in. She looked around. She saw blue walls, a fountain, people. She looked at Caden and said this was the most beautiful basement she'd ever lived in. Minjung stood nearby. She snorted, then she laughed, loudly. Minjun's first real laugh in the shelter, sharp and hoarse. Madison laughed back. The 2 laughs clashed in the stone hall, and the echo carried them through the corridors. Caden stood and watched. The 6th, the last. Everyone's here. He hadn't saved the world, but he'd saved 6, and they'd saved another 31, and that number would keep growing. Madison had been given a room, food, clean clothes. Aideen had treated her burn. Madison chattered non-stop about the ship, about the port, about the fire, about how she'd run, how she'd hidden, about seeing things she didn't want to describe, but would describe if someone poured her something warm to drink. She spoke of the tragedy as if it were an adventure, not because she didn't feel anything, because that was her way. Just as Minjun had his fists and his silence, just as Soyun had her books, just as Hera had her names, Madison had her words. So many words, loud and fast and often off-topic, but behind them lay a person who had lost her entire family in a single day and still hadn't allowed herself to cry about it. Caden knew this. He'd seen it in a past life. He didn't try to comfort her. He didn't ask questions. He simply told her that there were children in the shelter, 4 of them, from the families of the survivors. They don't speak any language other than Imperial. Madison knows the language of the Republic of Brilliant. The world is bigger than Velgart. The children need to know that. Madison fell silent. For the first time in an hour, she looked at him. She asked seriously. He answered seriously. She nodded. She said she'd start tomorrow. And she did, every day, in the morning. The 4 children sat in a circle and repeated after her the words in the language of a distant republic. Words for the sun, for water, for home, for a friend. Madison taught them, and for the first time in 6 months, she stopped smiling. Not because she was sad, because she was focused. And it was the only time she wasn't pretending that everything was fine. The children didn't notice. Caden did. A year had passed. Caden stood on the observation gallery and counted the lights. Not outside. There were no lights outside. He was counting the lights inside. The lamps in the hallways, the light from Diana's forge, the warm glow of Arian's greenhouse, the flickering of torches in Minjun's training hall. The refuge was no longer a refuge. It had become a city, a small one, cramped, imperfect, but a city. 53 people, blacksmiths, miners, families, children, Rand's guards, and the 6 women around whom it all held together. Each one like a pillar. Take one away, and the ceiling would sag. Caden wasn't a king. He wasn't a ruler. They called him the Elder, not because of his age, but by the right of being the first to enter, the first to open the door. He made decisions, allocated resources, settled disputes, but he didn't give orders. He suggested. And people listened, because every time he suggested something, it turned out to be right. Every time, without exception. This frightened some people. Rand Weiss, for example. He did everything Caden said, without objection. But Caden saw how the captain looked at him when he thought no one was watching, appraisingly, like a soldier looks at a weapon, trying to gauge how dangerous it is. Rand didn't recognize in him the former prisoner from the Marival dungeon, but he sensed something off, a tension, as if a thread hung between them, one he couldn't see but could feel. Caden didn't pull on that thread. Not yet. The change came at the end of the first year. Caden went on a patrol with Minjung and 2 miners. The usual route, the nearby slopes, checking the traps that Minjung had set for small game. The mountain goats had survived. Not all of them, but some. Mutated ones, strange ones, with gray fur and eyes that were too big, but edible. Areen inspected every carcass. The meat was clean. They were walking along the trail when Minjung stopped. She raised her hand, a signal for silence. Everyone froze. Caden listened. At first, nothing. Then he heard it. A voice. Not human. Low, vibrating, as if someone were running a bow across a string the size of a house. The sound came from below, from the valley, from the underworld. Minjung drew her sword. The miners raised their pickaxes. Caden stood and listened. The voice spoke. Not in Imperial, not in the ancient language of the tablets, in something else. But Caden understood. Not the words, the meaning. As if the meaning bypassed the words and flowed directly into his head. The voice spoke. We see light in the stone. We see the one who opened the door. We want to speak. Caden took a step toward the edge of the cliff. Minjung grabbed him by the shoulder. He said quietly that everything was fine. She said that nothing was fine. He looked down. In the black void of the other side stood a figure, far below, at the edge of visibility. Humanoid, tall, slender, black, but not dark. Black as a void, like a human-shaped hole. The figure raised a hand, slowly, as a greeting, or as a question. Caden didn't answer. He stepped back from the edge. He told the group they were going back, right now. That evening, he called a council meeting. Minjung, Areen, Soyeon, Rand. He told them what he'd seen. Rand said they needed to mine the approaches to the shelter. Minjung said they had nothing to do it with. Soyeon said the tablets mentioned contact with the outsider. The shelter's previous inhabitants had encountered her as well. Caden asked what was written on the plaques. Soyeon pulled out her notes. She read the translation aloud. They come when they sense the prophet. They come not to fight. They come to ask. Caden asked what they wanted to ask. Soyeon replied that the rest of the text was damaged, but there was one word that kept repeating. Door. Caden sat in silence. Door. The lower levels. Sealed. With a warning not to open them. The beings from the other side wanted to ask about the door, or they wanted him to open it. He remembered what he'd felt when he pressed his palm against the sealed doors down below. Nothing. The cold of metal. Silence. But Hera had said that the walls reacted to him, that the refuge breathed in time with him, that his footsteps awakened something ancient. Caden said that the lower levels would remain closed. No one goes below the 3rd level. Everyone nodded. Except Soyeon. She was looking at him, and her eyes behind her glasses were sharp. She said that a ban solves nothing. If his Nanka wants the door to open, she'll push. Not with force, with patience. Caden replied that he knew. She asked, then what? He replied that he needed time. She said that time was the only thing they had, and the only thing the outside world didn't have. That night, Caden went down to the sealed doors alone. He stood before them in the blue light. He pressed his palm against the cold metal, and for the first time, he felt a response. Not a tremor, not a sound. Warmth. Faint. Distant. As if someone behind the door were pressing their palm against it from the other side. The 2nd year. Caden began to have dreams. He hadn't had any dreams before, not since he woke up in the Grey Goose. Not a single one. He'd close his eyes and open them, and in between there was only darkness. Now, images appeared. A corridor, long, leading downward. The blue light on the walls turned to gold, then to white, then to nothing. Not darkness, nothingness. And in that nothingness stood a man. Caden's face, Caden's body, but not Caden. Different eyes, old, ancient, tired with a weariness that couldn't fit into a single human lifetime. The man stood and watched. He didn't speak. He just stood there. Caden woke up drenched in sweat. He told Hara about it, she in silence. Then she said that the walls were telling her the same thing, that someone was waiting below, for a long time, a very long time, and that this someone knew Caden's face. Not because they'd seen him, because they shared the same face. Caden asked what that meant. Hara replied that she didn't know, but that the walls weren't afraid of the one below. They remembered him, like a master. Soyeon worked on the tablets day and night. Caden forbade her to do so, but she didn't listen. He came to her in the middle of the night and found her at the table, pale, with red eyes, surrounded by stone debris and scribbled sheets of paper. He told her she needed to rest. She lifted her head and looked at him. She said she'd found something. He sat down. She laid out 3 tablets in front of him. The translation was incomplete, but the key words formed a story. The civilization that built the refuge had also encountered the other side, thousands of years ago. They weren't victims. They were the cause. They dug too deep. They extracted magic from the veins of the world too greedily. The veins burst. Iznanka came. Just like now, just like always. They built a refuge. They hid. They survived. But one of them, their prophet, found a way not just to survive Iznanka. He found a way to seal the rifts, restore the veins, and bring back peace. The price was simple, yet impossible. The prophet had to enter Iznanka and become a part of it, seal the rifts from within. Not die, become. Cease to be human and become the point where the other side and reality are stitched together. He did it. Peace returned. The veins healed. Civilization emerged from the refuge and built a new one, which, over time, became the Velgart Empire. But the prophet remained inside, not dead, not alive, sealed away in the lower levels of the refuge he himself had built. Thousands of years, alone, in nothingness. Caden sat and looked at the tablets. Then he asked why the other side had brought him back, why it had given him a second chance. Soyeon replied that there was one last tablet, the most damaged one. She had translated only fragments. The cycle. The veins will burst again. The world will fall again. The prophet inside will weaken. The seals will weaken. A new prophet is needed to enter, to replace the one inside, so that the cycle may continue. Caden stood up. He walked over to the window. He looked down into the shaft through which a dim light was streaming. Soyeon said quietly that Iznanka hadn't given him a second chance. She had brought him here so that he could open the door, so that he could enter, so that he could become the new lock. Caden stood by the window. His hands rested on the stone windowsill. He thought of Aaron's room with the window, of Diana's forge, of Minjung's training hall, of Hera's lanterns, of Soyeon's book, of Madison's flag, of the plate with dots. He thought that if he went down to the lower level and became the seal, the rifts would close, the other side would go away, peace would return, but he wouldn't be there. He'd be down there, in nothingness, for thousands of years, like the one who came before him. Soyeon sat quietly. Then she said there was another option, not to go in, not to open it, to live in the shelter. The other side won't touch it as long as the prophet is inside. They're safe. Caden replied that the world outside was dead. 2% of the survivors wandered among the ruins. Children were born in darkness. They could live in the shelter, but in 5 years or 10, the world would not return. Never. Soyeon said it was his decision, not hers. He replied that he knew. She stood up, gathered the tablets, stopped at the threshold. She said she didn't want him to leave. Her voice was steady, but her hands were clutching the signs too tightly. Caden didn't answer. She left. He stood alone. He counted his heartbeats, just like that first morning at the Grey Goose, just like back in the dungeon before he died. 1, 2, 3. Caden didn't tell anyone. For 2 weeks he walked around the shelter. He worked. He allocated resources. He settled disputes. He listened to Rand's security reports. He checked on Arine's greenhouse. He watched Diana assemble a new mechanism for the ventilation system. He listened as Madison taught the children to count in Brilliant. He sat next to Hara as she quietly went through the names of the novices. He stood on the observation gallery next to Minjung, who gazed into the darkness every evening without saying a word. He was memorizing everything, every face, every voice, every gesture, just like in his first life. Only back then, he had been memorizing a world that was destined to perish. Now he was memorizing a world that was destined to survive, without him. In the 3rd week, Aideen came to him. She stood in the doorway of his room, her hands folded in front of her. Her gray-green eyes looked straight ahead. She said she knew. Caden asked what she knew. She replied that she knew he was going to leave. He asked where from. She said he had changed, 2 weeks ago. He'd started looking at them as if he were saying goodbye. She'd seen that look, in refugee camps, in people who knew they wouldn't live to see the morning. That was exactly how they looked at their loved ones, committing them to memory. Caden sat on his cot. Aideen stood in the doorway. 3 steps separated them. He said he had to tell her the truth, the whole truth. She came in and sat down beside him. He spoke for a long time, quietly, without pauses, like a stream, about his first life, about his death in the dungeon, about the months he spent as a ghost, about how he'd seen her in the refugee camp, how she was dying of exhaustion, how she'd told him about the plate with dots 3 days before the end, how he'd remembered, how he'd returned, how he'd found her at the market, how he'd fashioned a plate out of clay because he wanted her to have at least that in this life. Aideen listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't ask any questions. She just sat there and listened. When he finished, she was silent for a long time. Then she said she understood now. Everything. The room with the window, the plate, why he'd always known what she needed before she even asked, why he looked at her as if he'd seen her before, because he had seen her before. She asked why he was telling her this now. He answered, because of the lower levels, because of the seal, because the only way to restore peace is to go in and stay, forever, like the one who came before him. Aideen didn't move. A patch of light from the shaft fell on the wall. Daylight. Warm. She quietly said no. Caden looked at her. She said no. She repeated it, not loudly, not hysterically, just no, like a statement of fact, like a diagnosis. No, you're not leaving. He said there was a world outside, that there were millions, that there were children in the dark. She said she knew, that it was all true, and that she didn't care. No. He said that was selfish. She replied, yes, and that she had the right to do so. For the first time in her life, she had the right to be selfish. He gave her a room with a window. He fashioned a plate for her. He saved her life. Twice, in 2 lifetimes. She wouldn't let him disappear into the darkness for 1,000 years. Caden looked at her hands, red from work, at her eyes, gray-green and wet, at her shoulders, straight and stubborn. He said he hadn't made a decision. She said that was a lie. He almost smiled, said, all right, that's a lie. She moved closer, resting her head on his shoulder. He didn't pull away. They sat like that in silence. The light from the shaft was changing. Daylight was fading. Gray light was coming in. Then darkness. They didn't move. The next day he told the others. He gathered all 6 of them, Minjung, Diana, Hera, Soyeon, Madison, and Aideen, who already knew and sat with a stony expression. He told them everything. His first life, his second, the secret of the refuge, the choice. Minjung listened in silence. Then she stood up. She walked over to him. She punched him in the shoulder. Hard. He staggered. She said he was an idiot, that he'd been warning the world for 8 years and the world hadn't listened, that they'd flogged him and left him to die, that he'd come back and saved them all, and now he wanted to go down to the basement forever because he felt indebted to the world that had betrayed him. She said the world didn't deserve him. Diana quietly said she agreed with Minjung. Hera silently took his hand. Soyeon took off her glasses and wiped them. She put them back on. She said that, from a scientific point of view, he wasn't the only option. The tablets mention a prophet, but they don't say there has to be only one prophet. Everyone looked at her. She said they needed time. They needed more tablets. They needed to understand the mechanism. Maybe there was a way to seal the fissures, not permanently, but for long enough for the veins to heal on their own. Maybe the seal could be activated remotely. Maybe. Madison said she didn't understand half of what Soyeon was saying, but if the gist was that Caden wanted to bury himself alive, she was categorically against it because he was the only one who took her jokes seriously. Caden stood surrounded by 6 women and listened. They were arguing, with each other, with him, with the world, with the injustice of the fact that everyone's fate depends on a single person. He listened, and something inside him was breaking. Not in a bad way, like ice breaking in the spring, heavy and painful, but beneath it, water, alive. The 3rd year began with the opening of the first seal. Soyeon found the instructions on the last tablet, which she had deciphered after 4 months of non-stop work. The seal was not opened with blood, not with force, with sound, a specific frequency that only the gift of hearing could reproduce. Hera. The three of them stood before the sealed door, Kaden, Soyeon, and Hera. Minjung stood behind them with her sword, just in case. Hera raised her palms and spread her fingers. She closed her eyes and began to sing. Not a song, a sound, a single pure tone that came not from her throat, but from her chest, from her gut, from her entire body. The walls responded. The blue light turned to gold. The door trembled. The lines of symbols on it flashed white. Then they faded. Then the metal began to move, slowly, heavily, with a rumble that echoed through the entire shelter and caused the fountain on the upper level to splash water. The door opened. Beyond it was a corridor, wide, golden light, warm air, and at the end of the corridor, a room. Kaden entered first. Minjun followed him, sword at the ready. Soyeon carried a torch, though it wasn't needed. Golden light streamed in from all directions. The room was circular. In the center stood a pedestal. On the pedestal lay a sphere, the size of a fist, transparent. Something was moving inside it. Slowly, like smoke, like water, like a thought. Kaden approached the sphere and looked into it, and he saw a face. His own face, just like in dreams. The eyes were ancient and weary. The mouth was slightly ajar, as if the person inside wanted to say something but couldn't. Soyeon examined the walls. They were covered with text, small, dense, thousands of words. She began to read. An hour later, she sat down on the floor. Her face was pale. She said it was a diary. The diary of a prophet who sealed himself away. Thousands of years of entries. He wrote from within, from nothingness. He wrote on walls that were both here and not here. He described how he felt the rifts, how he held them, how he grew tired, how he forgot who he was, how he remembered, how he forgot again. Thousands of years, alone, in the darkness that wasn't quite darkness. Kaden stood before the sphere and looked at the face inside. His face, not a metaphor, literally his face. The same features, the same cheekbones, the same jawline. Soyeon kept reading. Then she fell silent. Then she said quietly that she'd found something, in the latest entries, the most recent ones, if you can call entries from a century ago recent. The prophet inside the sphere knew that a new one would come. He sensed it. He was waiting, but not to be replaced. He was waiting to pass on the knowledge of how the seal works, how the faults are arranged, and how they could be closed in another way. Not by a single prophet, by a family. 7 points, 7 veins, 7 people who would stand in the right places and sing the right note. Not forever, just for a moment, long enough for the veins of the world to heal themselves, like bones. If you set them properly and give them time, they heal. The world can heal itself. You just need to keep the rifts closed long enough. Not 1,000 years, just one night. For one night, 7 people must stand at 7 points and hold the tone. Then the veins will lock together. Then the world will breathe a sigh of relief. Then the other side will depart. Not forever. The cycles will continue in thousands of years. But now, for these people, for this world, it's enough. Kaden listened and breathed. 7 people, 7 points, one night. Minjung asked who the 7 people were. Soyeon looked at Kaden. He understood. The prophet at the center. 6 around him. Not just any 6. Those he brought. Those he chose. Each with her own gift. Hera hears. Aiden heals. A living connection to growth and life. Diana creates. Hands that shape matter. Minjung protects, a will that never breaks. Soyeon knows, a memory that preserves. Madison believes, a light that never fades in the darkness. Kaden, the prophet, the one who sees. 7 facets of a single key. Kaden looked at the sphere. The face inside was looking at him, and for the first time in thousands of years, it smiled. Faintly, barely noticeable, like a person who had waited a very long time and finally saw the door. The preparations took 3 months. Soyeon translated the coordinates of the 7 points from ancient maps onto modern geography. Diana built the beacons, 7 devices that amplified sound, metal structures with resonating chambers that she designed from scratch. Every detail was hand-fitted, not a single unnecessary gap. Hollis helped her, silently, working side by side, as an equal. He no longer called her work toys. He hadn't said that once in 2 years, but Diana remembered every time he'd said it before. And every silent day spent beside the horn erased one of those memories. Hera taught the others about tone. Don't sing, just sound. Every person carries a vibration within them. You have to find it and let it out. Erin found her tone first, quiet, low, like the rumble of the earth. Minjung couldn't do it for a long time. She was angry. She clenched her fists. Hara gently touched her hand and told her not to force it, but to let go. Minjung closed her eyes. She thought of Yoon, how she'd slept on her lap that first night in the shelter. The tone came, sharp, clear, like a sword striking the air. Diana found her tone by accident. She was tapping a hammer against metal and heard the structure resonate. She repeated the strike with her voice, a metallic ring from a human throat. Hollis stood in the doorway and listened. Soyeon found her tone in a book, in poems written in her native language. She read aloud, and her voice naturally settled into a frequency that Hera confirmed with a nod. Madison found her tone in laughter. She was telling the children a story and laughed. And in the middle of her laughter was a sound, bright, high-pitched, like the sun, if it could make a sound.
Caden wasn't searching for his tone. He'd always had it, from the moment he awoke in the Grey Goose, from the moment he pressed his fingers against the wall and felt the world tremble. His tone was the silence between heartbeats, the pause between inhaling and exhaling, the nothingness from which everything is born. Before leaving, Caden went down to the sphere. He stood before it. The face inside was looking at him. Caden said quietly that he had come to take it home, that it had been alone long enough, that now it was its turn to rest. The face in the sphere closed its eyes, for the first time in thousands of years. The group left the shelter at dawn. Samaro, Caden, Erin, Minjun, Diana, Hera, Soyeon, Madison. Each carried Diana's beacon on their back. The metal structures were heavy, but no one complained. Rand Weiss stood at the entrance with the guards. He was in charge of the shelter while they were gone. Caden stopped in front of him. He looked him in the eyes. Rand looked back. And at that moment, Caden saw it. Rand knew. Not from the very beginning, but at some point over the past 2 years, he had remembered. The face of the prisoner in the dungeon, swollen, bloodied. But a face, the same eyes, the same gaze. Rand knew who he was. And he kept silent, for 2 years. He worked, he obeyed, he defended the hideout, not because Caden ordered him to, because it was the right thing to do, the only way he'd found to atone for what he'd done in Maraval's basement. Not with words, with deeds. 2 years of deeds. Caden held out his hand. Rand shook it. This time, Caden didn't squeeze any harder than necessary. Neither did Rand. Just a handshake between 2 people who had found a way to live with the past without destroying each other. The journey to the 7 points took a week. The other side parted. It didn't retreat. It parted, like a crowd before a person walking through. A black void opened up around them, forming a corridor. Narrow, but wide enough. Creatures from the other side stood at the edges, silently. Humanoid shadows, holes shaped like people. They didn't attack. They didn't interfere. They watched. Minjun walked with her sword at the ready. Caden told her it wasn't necessary. She didn't sheath it. She said she needed it. On the 7th day, they stood, each at her own point. 7 points on a map that had once been the Velgard Empire. Now it was a black void with islands of stone and ash. Caden stood in the center, the 6 of them around him, far apart, invisible to one another, connected only by a tone. He closed his eyes. He sensed them, all 6 of them, like points of warmth in a cold world. Erin to the north, quiet and warm. Minjung to the south, sharp and bright. Diana to the west, ringing and stubborn. Hera to the east, subtle and deep. Soyeon above, clear and precise. Madison below, bright and loud. He himself in the center. Silence. He opened his mouth and sang. Not a song, a tone. His own tone. The silence between heartbeats. A pause. Nothingness. They answered. 6 voices, 6 tones, each its own, each unique. Together, they formed a sound the world hadn't heard in thousands of years. Not harmony, not a chord, something greater. As if reality itself had remembered what it sounded like and echoed them. The earth trembled. It did not collapse. It sighed, like a sleeper waking up. The fissures were closing. Caden felt each one, 17, one after another, like wounds that are healing. The edges came together. The veins of the world trembled and fused, slowly, painfully, but they fused. The darkness receded, not instantly, like water into sand. The blackness thinned, turned gray. It grew lighter. Through it, the earth emerged. Stones, ash, fragments of what had once been the world, but earth, real, solid. The sky cleared. The cracks were healing, one after another. Light returned. Not sunlight, dawn light. Gray, then pink, then golden. The first real dawn in 3 years. Caden sang and wept, for the first time in 2 lifetimes. Tears streamed down his face, and he didn't wipe them away. Not because his hands were full, because he didn't want to. The melody rang out. 6 voices held it. He held them. 7 people stood in the midst of a dead world and sang it back to life. The night ended at dawn. The melody faded. Caden fell silent. He opened his eyes. The world before him was gray, empty, dead. But the sky was clear, blue, without a single crack. The veins of the world were pulsing, weakly, barely, like the heart of a man who'd just been pulled from the water, but they were pulsing. He pressed his palm against the ground, a tremor, a different one, not one of pain, alive, like the tremor of a newborn. Caden sat down on a rock in the middle of what had once been a road. All around were ruins, ashes, the shards of an empire that thought it would last forever. But something was pushing its way through the ashes, small, green, a sprout, the first in 3 years. He sat there, watching the sprout, and waited for the others. They arrived around noon, one after another. Adrian was the first. She walked through the gray ash, and her footsteps left marks, deep, clear, real. She saw Caden. She saw the sprout. She sat down next to him. Minjun came second, sword on her back, dirty, tired, with a smile wider than her face. She sat down next to him and nudged Caden with her shoulder. Diana arrived with a beacon on her back. She refused to throw it away. She said she'd spent 3 months on it and it would still come in handy. She sat down and began taking the mechanism apart, checking every gear. Hollis would have nodded. Hera arrived barefoot. She'd taken off her shoes somewhere along the way. She said she wanted to feel the ground, the real one, for the first time in 3 years. She stepped carefully on the ash, as if on water. Soyeon arrived with a sign tucked under her arm. She'd taken one from the shelter. She said the world needed to know what had happened. Who built the shelter? Who was the first to seal off the other side? Who spent 1,000 years alone in the darkness? This story must not be repeated, and it must not be forgotten. Madison was the last to arrive. She was running. She was shouting something in the brilliant language. She fell, she got up, she ran on. She made it. She collapsed onto the ground next to the others. She was laughing and crying at the same time. The flag of the Republic was tied to her backpack and fluttered in the wind. The 7 of them sat on a rock in the middle of a dead world that was beginning to breathe. All around them were ashes and ruins. Above them, a clear sky. Beneath them, the earth trembling with a new, living tremor. A sprout next to Caden's foot stirred in the wind, small, green, stubborn. Caden looked at it, then at the 6 women around him, then at the horizon, where gray ash stretched to the edge of sight. The world was empty. The world was dead. The world was theirs. And it would begin anew. Not with the Empire, not with the temples, not with the palaces, nor with the caste ranks from F to SSS. With the sprout, with the 7 people on the rock, with the room for aiding with the window, from Diana's forge, where her father had praised her for the first time, from a plate with dots on it, from a silver bracelet, from a wooden lantern, from a book of poetry, from the flag of a distant republic, from small things, real things. Caden sat in silence. Aideen sat beside him. Her hand lay in his, warm, alive. He didn't say, "I was talking." He didn't say anything. He just sat there and looked at the sprout, at the first green leaf of a new world. And that was enough.